Keanu Reeves humiliates liberal host Liv after shocking accusation about his girlfriend. It was supposed to be just another typical evening for Keanu Reeves on a talk show. He'd been invited by one of the most well-known liberal hosts in the country, someone famous for stirring up controversy and making headlines with every guest interview. Keanu, known for his calm demeanor and quiet charisma, was no stranger to the spotlight, but this night felt different. The host had a reputation for getting under people's skin and pushing them into uncomfortable conversations, but Keanu was a pro. He had handled tough situations before, whether it was through acting or in interviews, and he was always polite, composed, and professional. However, no one could have predicted the turn this conversation would take. The show had started in the usual fashion. Keanu greeted the audience, his smile warm and welcoming, as the host joked about Keanu's long-standing career and recent projects. The conversation shifted to Keanu's role in the industry, his rise to fame, and his down-to-earth persona. The audience was loving it, hanging on every word, as they always did when Keanu spoke. He was the epitome of a humble superstar, someone who didn't let his fame affect his genuine nature. The host, as expected, wanted to dig deeper, to peel back the layers of Keanu's private life. But Keanu wasn't the kind of person to give away personal details easily. "Keanu, you've been with your girlfriend for a while now," the host said casually, leaning forward with a sly grin on his face. Keanu's expression remained neutral. He didn't want to dive into anything too personal, but knew the question was coming. The host continued, "But there have been some rumors circulating about her involvement in some pretty controversial activities. What do you think about that?" The host's words hung in the air, the audience instantly aware that this was not just another casual question. The tension in the room shifted. Keanu raised his eyebrows slightly, a sign that he was caught off guard but not rattled. His eyes, always calm, never wavered. He was used to dealing with the press, but this was different. This wasn't just an innocent question. This was a direct accusation. The host had just suggested that Keanu's girlfriend was tied to something controversial, something the audience couldn't quite yet understand. Keanu's mind raced, processing what had just been said. He had to decide quickly whether to ignore the comment or address it head-on. The audience waited in silence, hanging on every word that was about to come from Keanu. The host, sensing an opening, leaned in further, almost daring Keanu to respond. "What do you say to those who believe your girlfriend's views align with certain extreme political groups?" the host pressed, now clearly relishing the discomfort in the air. Keanu's smile didn't falter. His voice remained steady as he calmly replied, "I think people love to make assumptions when they don't have all the facts." His words were measured and deliberate, but there was an underlying sharpness to them. The host had expected Keanu to defend his girlfriend, to get defensive or upset. But instead, Keanu remained a picture of composure. He wasn't about to let the host bait him into a confrontation. The host, however, wasn't ready to back down. He had his own agenda, one that involved stirring the pot. He was known for being relentless when it came to pushing his guests into uncomfortable territory, and this was no different. "But don't you think that the public deserves to know about your personal life? Especially if it's affecting your public image?" the host asked, his tone now more probing. Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression never wavered. He wasn't angry, but there was a quiet intensity about him now. "I don't think the public needs to know everything," Keanu replied, his voice calm but firm. "I think there's value in keeping some things private, and honestly, I don't feel the need to justify anyone's assumptions." The host, caught off guard by Keanu's directness, tried to regain control of the conversation. But there was an air of tension now. The room had shifted. The audience, who had been eagerly watching the interview moments before, were now intrigued, caught in the uncertainty of what was happening. The host's usual bravado began to falter. He wasn't prepared for someone like Keanu, who wouldn't be pushed into a corner. This wasn't a typical celebrity interview. This was turning into something much bigger. The host, trying to maintain his cool, laughed awkwardly. "I see," he said, but there was a hint of discomfort in his voice now. "So you're saying that these rumors, these accusations about your girlfriend, they don't bother you?" Keanu's eyes met his, unwavering. "I don't let rumors bother me," he said simply, "and I don't think I need to address them. If people want to focus on that kind of thing, that's their choice, but I've got better things to focus on." The host, now visibly frustrated, leaned back in his chair, trying to regain some semblance of control. But it was clear that the dynamic had changed. Keanu had turned the tables. The host had hoped to corner him, to get him to react with emotion or defensiveness. Instead, Keanu had done the opposite. He remained calm, collected, and in his own way, humiliated the host without ever raising his voice. The audience, who had been expecting drama, now seemed unsure of how to react. They had anticipated a fiery exchange, but instead, they were witnessing something much more powerful: Keanu's ability to stay composed in the face of attack. The host, now realizing that he had miscalculated, tried to steer the conversation back to safer territory. But it was too late. The damage had been done. As the conversation moved forward, the host tried to salvage the interview by asking Keanu more casual questions. But the audience could sense the shift. The host had lost his edge, and Keanu, in his quiet way, had won the moment. No words needed to be said to convey what had just transpired. Keanu's grace under pressure, his refusal to engage in petty gossip, spoke louder than anything else. The host, who had prided himself on getting under the skin of his guests, had been humiliated, and Keanu, as always, had remained the picture of class. The interview may have continued, but the audience would never forget the quiet power Keanu had shown in those brief, tense moments. The tension in the air was palpable, and the audience could feel it. Keanu Reeves had just responded to a deeply personal accusation with a calmness and poise that few could match. The host, who had started the interview with his usual smug confidence, was now visibly shaken. His question had not elicited the expected reaction from Keanu. Instead of an emotional outburst or a defensive statement, Keanu had responded with an unshakable resolve that left the host reeling. For a moment, the host didn't know how to continue. His usual tactics, the ones that had made him famous for getting under people's skin, weren't working. He had thought that by pressing Keanu on his girlfriend's rumored political leanings, he would be able to provoke a reaction, something to stir the pot and get the audience's attention. But instead, Keanu had shown the world exactly how unbothered he was by such baseless accusations. The host had expected drama, but what he got was a lesson in grace under pressure. The host, now visibly flustered, tried to regain control of the conversation. He cleared his throat and shifted in his seat, trying to act as if nothing had happened. "So, Keanu," he began, attempting to sound casual again, "you're saying that you don't let rumors affect you, huh?" That's pretty impressive. But there was a hint of nervousness in his voice, a crack in the facade he had carefully crafted over the years. The host knew he had lost some ground, and he could sense that the audience was no longer on his side. They had witnessed something rare, a celebrity who refused to play the game, who wouldn't let himself be manipulated. Keanu, still composed, didn't take the bait. He smiled politely but didn't say anything at first. He was content to let the host speak, knowing that his silence would only add to the awkwardness of the moment. Keanu wasn't interested in feeding into the drama. He didn't care for the sensationalism that the host thrived on. Instead, he was determined to remain above it all, to show the audience that there was a better way to handle conflict, with dignity and integrity. The host, now struggling to keep the conversation moving, pressed on. "But come on, Keanu. Don't you think the public has a right to know what's going on in your personal life? You've been in the spotlight for decades. People are curious about you and about who you're with. Don't you owe it to them to clear the air?" Keanu's gaze never faltered. He had heard this line of questioning before, many times over the years. People were always curious about his relationships, his private life, but Keanu had never been one to feed that curiosity. He wasn't interested in explaining himself to anyone, especially when it came to something as personal as his love life. He believed that some things were meant to remain private, and that was something he had always stood by. "I don't think I owe anyone an explanation about my personal life," Keanu said, his voice still calm but firm. "I think it's important to keep some things for yourself. People can speculate all they want, but that doesn't mean I have to entertain their assumptions. My girlfriend and I are happy, and that's all that matters." His words were simple, but they were powerful. The host, clearly not expecting this kind of answer, was left momentarily speechless. Keanu's ability to stay calm, to not let the host's questions rile him, was a testament to his strength of character. While the host struggled to find his footing, Keanu remained steady, unwavering in his convictions. The audience, who had initially been on the edge of their seats waiting for the drama to unfold, were now beginning to see something different. They were witnessing a rare display of composure and maturity. Keanu wasn't just answering questions. He was setting an example, showing them how to rise above the noise and focus on what truly mattered. The host, realizing that his usual tactics weren't working, tried to pivot. "Well, I have to admit, Keanu, you're not what I expected," he said with a forced chuckle, attempting to regain his previous air of confidence. "But come on, surely you must have had moments when you felt like you wanted to defend yourself, right? Like when people say things that aren't true about you or the people you care about." Keanu didn't hesitate. "Of course, I've had moments where I felt hurt or frustrated," he said, his tone still calm. "But I've learned that reacting to every little rumor or accusation only gives it more power. I'd rather focus on the things that bring me joy and peace, like my work, my family, and the people I love. That's where my energy goes." The host tried to hide his frustration, but it was becoming more obvious with every passing second. He had expected Keanu to crack, to let the pressure get to him. But instead, Keanu had turned the tables, making it clear that he wasn't interested in playing the game. And in doing so, Keanu had put the host in an uncomfortable position. The host, who was used to being in control, was now on the defensive, and he didn't quite know how to recover. The audience, who had been watching this back-and-forth play out, were now completely engrossed. What had started as a typical celebrity interview had turned into something much more. Keanu wasn't just a guest on the show. He had become the center of attention, not because of any controversy, but because of his refusal to give in to it. He was showing the audience that there was a different way to handle such situations, a way that didn't involve drama or sensationalism. The host, realizing that he wasn't going to get the reaction he had hoped for, attempted to shift the conversation back to safer topics. "All right, well, moving on," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Let's talk about your latest film. How was the experience working on it?" He quickly turned to a more neutral subject, eager to move away from the uncomfortable silence that had fallen between them. Keanu, ever the professional, was happy to oblige. "The film was a great experience," he said with a smile, his tone lightening as he shifted gears. "I got to work with some amazing people, and the story was one I really connected with." It was a challenge, but a good one. His demeanor was back to its usual calm, and the audience could feel the shift. Keanu had taken control of the situation, and now the conversation was flowing once again. The host, though still trying to recover, had clearly lost his edge. The interview, which had started off with such promise for drama and scandal, had instead become a lesson in composure. Keanu had shown everyone that sometimes the best response to a provocative question isn't a heated reply, but a calm, thoughtful one. The host had tried to manipulate the conversation, but Keanu had expertly turned the tables, making him the one who was on the defensive. As the interview continued, it was clear to everyone watching that Keanu had won this round. Not because he had spoken the loudest or made the boldest statement, but because he had refused to play the game. He had remained true to himself, and in doing so, he had humiliated the host without ever raising his voice. It was a powerful reminder of the strength that comes from staying calm and collected, no matter the provocation. By the end of the interview, the host had little choice but to wrap things up. The conversation had lost its earlier spark, and the audience, while appreciative of Keanu's calm demeanor, were left with a lingering sense of discomfort toward the host's attempt to stir up controversy. Keanu had done what he always did. He had stayed true to his values and shown the world that there was more to life than drama and sensationalism. And in doing so, he had left a lasting impression on everyone watching. As the interview continued, the host's attempt to regain control of the conversation became more and more evident. The tone had shifted from playful and lighthearted to increasingly tense. The audience, initially thrilled by the idea of a juicy, controversial interview, were now quietly observing, sensing that things had taken an unexpected turn. Keanu, however, was completely unfazed. His calmness was almost disarming. The host, now realizing he wasn't going to get the emotional reaction he'd hoped for, tried desperately to steer the conversation back to safer, more neutral topics. But Keanu wasn't going to let himself get pulled into the trap of sensationalism. He had already proven that he wasn't interested in engaging in the drama. The host, trying to recover some of his dignity, shifted his approach. Instead of focusing on the personal accusations, he decided to talk about Keanu's professional life, an area he thought might be easier to navigate. "So, Keanu, let's talk about your recent projects," the host said, forcing a smile. "You've been in the industry for so long and you've done so many incredible things. What's been your most memorable experience on set?" Keanu's eyes softened as he spoke. "Every film is unique in its own way. But I think the most memorable experiences are the ones where I get to work with people who are passionate about the story we're telling," he said thoughtfully. "It's not just about the film or the paycheck. It's about creating something meaningful, something that resonates with the audience. That's what keeps me coming back." The host nodded, trying to show interest, but it was clear he wasn't fully invested in the conversation. His mind was still on the earlier exchange, still smarting from Keanu's refusal to engage in the drama. He had built a career on being provocative, on getting under the skin of his guests, and he wasn't going to let one slip-up ruin his reputation. His next question came out a little too quickly, his desperation to regain the upper hand obvious. "Do you think Hollywood is changing, Keanu?" the host asked. "Do you feel like there's been a shift in the kinds of roles you're being offered, or in the way the industry treats its stars?" Keanu paused, giving the question some thought before responding. "I think Hollywood has always been evolving, just like any other industry," he said, his voice steady. "There are ups and downs, trends that come and go, but I think what really matters is the kind of work you choose to be a part of. I've always tried to pick roles that speak to me, whether they're big-budget blockbusters or smaller, more intimate projects. It's about the story, not the fame." The host, clearly trying to keep the conversation going without bringing up the earlier topic, now found himself getting lost in the depth of Keanu's response. He had hoped for something simple, something he could use to bring the conversation back to the spotlight. But Keanu had a way of speaking that was almost meditative. His answers were thoughtful, genuine, and always avoided the surface-level banter the host was used to. "Right," the host said, his voice lacking the usual energy it once had. "I get that. But you know, you've been in some of the most iconic movies in history, The Matrix, John Wick, and so on. You've created these larger-than-life characters. Do you ever feel the pressure of living up to those roles? I mean, is it hard to constantly be in the public eye?" Keanu's eyes seemed to reflect a quiet understanding. He had been in the spotlight for decades, long before the world had become obsessed with social media and the constant pressure to stay relevant. But Keanu never let the fame dictate who he was. He didn't play the game and he didn't need to. His response was humble, as it always was. "It's not about living up to the roles, really," Keanu explained. "The characters I've played, whether it's Neo or John Wick, are just parts of the bigger picture. What matters to me is doing the work, staying true to the story, and connecting with the people who enjoy it. The public eye doesn't dictate my choices. I do." The host sat back in his chair, momentarily silenced by Keanu's words. The audience, too, seemed to be reflecting on what Keanu had said. It wasn't just a matter of fame and fortune for him. It was about something deeper. Keanu had always been one to focus on his craft, not his image, and it was becoming more and more clear that his refusal to engage in the host's attempts at drama wasn't just a coincidence. It was who he was. The host shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that he wasn't going to get the kind of soundbite he was hoping for. He had tried to make this about drama, about personal issues, but Keanu had turned the conversation into something much more meaningful. The host, now feeling the weight of his own frustration, attempted to move on yet again, but his attempts lacked the same confident flair he had started with. "So, I guess, looking ahead," the host said, trying to salvage the moment. "What's next for you, Keanu? Do you have any big projects in the works?" Keanu's smile returned, and his voice softened. "I'm always working on something," he said. "But I don't like to talk about things before they're ready. I just focus on what's in front of me and let things unfold naturally." The host was caught off guard by this response. He had hoped for a bit of a tease, some hint about what Keanu was working on next, but Keanu had once again sidestepped the question. He wasn't interested in the hype, the build-up, or the anticipation. He wasn't trying to sell anything. He was simply doing the work, focusing on what he loved, and leaving the rest to take care of itself. It was clear now to the audience that this interview was unlike any other they had seen. They had tuned in expecting to witness a battle of wits, a clash between Keanu's calm demeanor and the host's sharp questioning. But instead, They had witnessed something far more compelling, the quiet power of someone who refused to engage in the spectacle. Keanu had taken every jab the host threw at him and turned it into an opportunity to reflect on what truly mattered. He had shown the audience that there was more to life than drama, and that sometimes the strongest move was simply to stay true to yourself. The host, realizing he was out of his depth, tried to push the interview to its conclusion. "Well, I think we're out of time," he said, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. "Keanu, it's been great having you on the show. Thanks for being here." Keanu nodded, his smile warm and sincere. "Thank you for having me," he said simply, and with that the interview came to a close. As the cameras cut away and the credits began to roll, it was clear that the audience had just witnessed something extraordinary. Keanu had been put in a position where he could have easily engaged in the drama, could have risen to the challenge of defending himself or his loved ones. But instead, he had chosen to take the high road. He had humiliated the host not by getting angry or defensive, but by refusing to let the drama pull him into its web. And in doing so, Keanu had shown the world what true strength really looked like. As the interview came to an end, the host, trying to salvage what was left of the conversation, glanced nervously at the clock. The tension that had once been in the air had now settled into an uncomfortable quiet. Keanu's presence, always calm and collected, had subtly shifted the dynamic. The audience, once eagerly anticipating a dramatic confrontation, were now caught in the aftermath of the interaction, reflecting on what they had just witnessed. Keanu, it seemed, had emerged victorious not through fiery words or quick comebacks, but by simply remaining true to himself. The host tried his best to keep the mood light as he moved toward the final questions, but his earlier bravado had clearly evaporated. "Well, I think it's safe to say you've surprised us all tonight, Keanu," he said with a half-hearted chuckle, still trying to regain his composure. "I've got to admit, I wasn't expecting this level of calmness. Most people would have snapped at some point. But you handled it with class, that's for sure." Keanu smiled, but it was a smile that was more knowing than anything else. "I've learned over the years that reacting with anger or frustration only gives more power to things that don't matter," he replied, his voice steady and peaceful. "It's important to stay focused on what's important and not get caught up in the noise." The host, now on the back foot, tried to turn the conversation back to lighter subjects. "Well, I think that's a great perspective. So, Keanu, do you think that's something you've always had, this ability to stay calm under pressure? Or is it something you've developed over time?" Keanu thought for a moment before answering. "I think it's a little bit of both," he said thoughtfully. "I've always been a private person, so I've naturally stayed out of the limelight. But as I've gotten older, I've realized that the world doesn't need to see everything. There's power in being quiet, in listening instead of reacting. It's something I've worked on, for sure." The host, eager to shift gears, asked another question. "And what about your fans? We know you've got a huge following, people who admire you not just for your acting, but for who you are as a person. What does that mean to you?" Keanu paused for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "It means everything to me," he said sincerely. "I've always felt a deep connection to my fans. They're the ones who have supported me through everything. It's humbling, really, to know that the work I do can have an impact on people. But at the end of the day, I try to remember that I'm just a person, just like everyone else." There was something so genuine in his response that it struck a chord with the audience. They weren't just hearing from a movie star, they were hearing from a man who truly understood the value of humility and self-awareness. Keanu didn't put himself on a pedestal. He didn't seek out adoration. He simply did the work and let everything else fall into place. The host, sensing that the interview was winding down, tried to steer it toward a final, harmless question. "All right, Keanu, last question for the night," he said, forcing a grin. "If you could give one piece of advice to anyone who's struggling, someone who feels lost or out of place, what would you say?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "I would say that everyone has their own path," he began. "It's easy to look at others and think that you should be where they are or that you should be doing what they're doing. But the truth is, everyone's journey is different. So be kind to yourself, be patient, don't rush things. And above all, trust that things will unfold the way they're meant to." The host nodded, clearly impressed by the simplicity and depth of Keanu's words. The audience, too, was quiet, reflecting on the wisdom that had just been shared. It wasn't just about acting or fame. It was about life, about finding peace and balance in the chaos of the world. As the interview finally drew to a close, the host let out a soft sigh of relief. The lights were dimming, the crew preparing for the next segment. Keanu had once again shown his ability to take control of the room, not by dominating it, but by simply existing within it, unflinching and serene. The host, who had tried so hard to provoke a reaction, had been completely outclassed. "Keanu, it's been a pleasure," the host said, still attempting to regain some semblance of his earlier energy. "Thank you for being here tonight. You've definitely left us with a lot to think about." Keanu stood up, offering a warm handshake to the host. "Thank you for having me," he said with a genuine smile. "It was a good conversation." As Keanu made his way off the stage, the audience erupted into applause. It wasn't just a polite round of applause. This was different. The energy in the room was palpable, a collective appreciation for the way Keanu had handled himself. His calmness, his grace had left a lasting impression. He hadn't engaged in the drama, hadn't played the game. He had simply been himself, honest, humble, and unshakable. The host, still sitting behind his desk, let out a quiet sigh. He had expected fireworks, a heated exchange, a viral moment. But instead, he had gotten a masterclass in composure. He couldn't help but feel a bit humbled by the experience. It wasn't often that someone managed to turn the tables on him, to make him feel small in such a subtle way. But Keanu had done it with nothing more than a calm voice and a firm sense of self. As the lights dimmed and the credits began to roll, the viewers at home were left with a sense of admiration for Keanu. They had seen the real Keanu Reeves tonight, the person behind the movie star, the actor behind the public figure. And in that moment, it became clear that Keanu wasn't just someone who could play tough characters on screen. He was someone who had mastered the art of handling the toughest moments in life with grace and dignity. The host, once the center of attention, now seemed to fade into the background. The night had started with his attempt to stir the pot, to make the conversation something it was. But in the end, it was Keanu who had defined the conversation, who had taken control of the narrative without ever raising his voice. The audience, still applauding, understood that this had been a rare moment, one where the person at the center of the storm wasn't just enduring it, but was quietly showing everyone around him how to weather it with strength and humility. As the camera faded to black, the host knew that this interview would go down as one of the most memorable of his career. Not because of anything he had done, but because of the way Keanu Reeves had made an impact without ever trying to steal the spotlight. He had let the world see him as he truly was, someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. And in doing so, Keanu had left an unforgettable mark on the audience, one that would stay with them long after the interview had ended. The aftermath of the interview was unlike anything the host had expected. In the hours that followed, the buzz around the talk show began to grow, and it wasn't because of the usual controversies or heated exchanges. No, this time the conversation was about Keanu Reeves, and more specifically, the way he had handled the entire situation with such remarkable composure. As the story spread across social media and news outlets, the world began to take notice of something extraordinary that had unfolded on that stage. Fans and critics alike couldn't stop talking about the calm strength Keanu had displayed. On the internet, where celebrity drama often fuels endless debates and gossip, Keanu's response stood out as a refreshing change. People were sharing clips of the interview, many of them commenting on how Keanu had humiliated the host without ever raising his voice or losing his temper. In a world that seemed obsessed with conflict, Keanu had simply refused to engage in it. And in doing so, he had earned the admiration of millions. Across social media platforms, the hashtags KeanuWins and Command Collected trended, with fans from all over the world posting their appreciation for his poise. It wasn't just the content of his answers that resonated with people. It was the way he carried himself. In a time when every word a celebrity says is dissected and analyzed, Keanu had reminded the world that sometimes the strongest response to negativity is silence and dignity. He didn't have to get angry or defensive. He didn't need to prove anyone wrong. He simply stayed true to his values, and that, in itself, was enough. The host, on the other hand, found himself in an entirely different position. As the interview replayed on television, he began to feel the weight of what had transpired. The dramatic moment he had hoped for, the conflict he had anticipated, had not materialized. Instead, Keanu had turned the tables, and now the host was facing public scrutiny. His earlier comments and attempts to provoke a reaction had backfired. The people who had once seen him as a sharp, fearless interviewer now questioned his tactics. Had he crossed a line? Had he tried to manipulate the conversation too much? The backlash was swift. News outlets that had initially praised the host's provocative questioning now began to reconsider their stance. Critics on social media pointed out how unprofessional his approach had been, suggesting that he had tried to make Keanu uncomfortable for the sake of sensationalism. Even other celebrities weighed in, expressing their admiration for how Keanu had handled the situation. It was clear that the host had underestimated the strength of his guest, and now he was paying the price for it. In contrast, Keanu's reputation only grew stronger. Fans took to online forums, discussing how refreshing it was to see someone who wasn't interested in engaging with petty drama. People admired Keanu not just for his talent as an actor, but for his integrity as a person. In a world where it often seemed that public figures were rewarded for stirring up controversy, Keanu had shown that there was a different way to succeed. His actions were a testament to the power of staying true to oneself, even in the face of provocation. Meanwhile, Keanu himself remained as humble as ever. He had never been one to seek the spotlight, and even now, as the world celebrated his composed response to the interview, he wasn't interested in basking in the attention. He didn't want the viral moment to overshadow the work he had always cared about, the films he had made, the stories he had told, and the people he had worked with. As much as he appreciated the support, he simply wanted to keep moving forward, focused on what mattered most to him. When asked about the interview in a follow-up conversation, Keanu's response was characteristically modest. "It was just another conversation," he said. "I don't think it was anything special. I just don't see the point in feeding into drama. Life's too short for that." His words were simple, yet they carried a depth that resonated with people around the world. Keanu wasn't looking for validation or praise. He was simply living his truth, and that, it seemed, was enough. As the days passed, the story of the interview became a touchstone for discussions about celebrity culture, media manipulation, and the power of staying grounded in one's values. Talk shows and podcasts began analyzing what had happened, dissecting the subtle but powerful ways in which Keanu had humiliated the host without saying a single harsh word. Experts praised his ability to remain composed under pressure, noting that it was a rare and admirable trait in a world where people often feel compelled to react immediately and emotionally. Even people who weren't fans of Keanu's films began to recognize the strength of his character. In a time when public figures were often expected to engage in debates or fight back against criticism, Keanu had simply chosen not to play the game. His refusal to engage with negativity had left a lasting impression, one that went far beyond the usual celebrity antics. People admired his ability to stay above the fray, and that admiration only grew as more time passed. Behind the scenes, the host likely reflected on the fallout from the interview. Perhaps he realized that his attempt to provoke Keanu had been misguided. After all, it wasn't just about asking questions. It was about respecting the boundaries of others, especially when it came to their personal lives. In an industry that often valued sensationalism over substance, Keanu had reminded everyone of the importance of respecting privacy and showing kindness. As the weeks went on, the host's reputation continued to take a hit. His once popular talk show, known for its confrontational style, began to lose viewers. The audience that had once tuned in for the drama now seemed less interested in the spectacle of conflict. Instead, they were drawn to authenticity, to people like Keanu who weren't afraid to take a step back from the noise. Media outlets that had once praised the host's ability to get a rise out of his guests now questioned his ethics. The landscape of celebrity interviews was changing, and it was clear that the old ways of provoking conflict for entertainment value were starting to lose their appeal. Keanu, however, remained unaffected by the controversy surrounding the interview. As the world turned its attention elsewhere, he continued to do what he had always done: acting, working on new projects, and living his life with the same humility that had always defined him. He didn't need the spotlight to shine brighter. He was content to simply be himself, and that was enough. For Keanu, the most important thing was that he had stayed true to his own values. In a world that constantly tried to pull people in different directions, Keanu had proven that it was possible to stand firm and remain grounded. And so, as the dust settled, Keanu's legacy continued to grow, not just as a talented actor, but as a person of integrity and strength. In a time when the world often seemed obsessed with spectacle and drama, Keanu had shown that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to stay silent, stay calm, and let your actions speak for themselves. Through his grace and composure, he had humiliated no one except the system that thrived on negativity, and in doing so, he had won the respect of millions. The host, for his part, would likely continue with his career, but the memory of that interview would linger in the minds of both the audience and the media. Keanu had left an indelible mark on that moment, and the lesson he taught would remain long after the show had ended. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about choosing a higher path, one where respect, dignity, and authenticity took precedence over sensationalism and drama. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. In the weeks that followed the interview, the impact of Keanu's calm, collected response continued to resonate, not just with his fans, but with the wider public. The media cycle, so often consumed with scandals and controversies, found itself unable to move past what had transpired. What should have been just another celebrity interview had turned into a lesson in dignity and personal strength, and people were still talking about it, reflecting on how Keanu had handled himself. Keanu, as always, remained largely out of the spotlight after the interview. He didn't seek out further attention or bask in the praise that was flowing in from every corner. He wasn't interested in that. He had never been one to chase fame or recognition. Instead, he continued with his life, quietly working on new projects and enjoying time with his loved ones. But behind the scenes, he could see the shift in how people were talking about him. The public's view of him had always been positive, but now, it seemed, there was a deeper level of admiration, a respect for the way he had chosen to respond to the world around him. The host, on the other hand, found himself in a much more complicated situation. His attempts to manipulate the conversation had backfired. He had gone into the interview expecting a moment of drama, perhaps even a fight, but what he got was a reminder of his own limitations. As the host's interview style was scrutinized more and more, it became clear that the world wasn't as interested in sensationalism as it once had been. People were starting to see through the gimmicks, and they were drawn to authenticity instead. Despite the growing backlash, the host's career didn't crash overnight. He continued to appear on his show, but it was evident that his charm had worn thin. The audience no longer saw him as the sharp, quick-witted interviewer they once did. Instead, they saw him as someone who had tried too hard to stir up drama, someone who had crossed a line. His usual guests, once eager to appear on his show, began to hesitate. They were more aware now of what might happen if they said something he didn't like, more conscious of how his questioning could quickly turn uncomfortable. The host's bravado had been broken, and in its place was a hint of desperation. The shift wasn't just evident in the host's career, but in the entire landscape of media. Talk shows and interviews began to change. Where once there was an emphasis on conflict, confrontation, and controversy, there was now a growing desire for something more genuine. The public had witnessed Keanu's response and had made their decision. They wanted more of the kind of quiet strength Keanu had displayed. The celebrity interview, a staple of modern entertainment, began to evolve. It wasn't enough to simply provoke guests for the sake of a viral moment. People wanted to see something real, something substantive. The media itself began to recognize that, and slowly, the narrative began to shift away from sensationalism toward deeper, more meaningful discussions. For Keanu, this was business as usual. He didn't concern himself with what others were saying or how his actions had changed the public's view of him. He simply went on with his life, a life that had always been grounded in the things that mattered most: his family, his work, and his personal integrity. Keanu had never been interested in the spotlight for its own sake. He had always seen it as something that was part of his job, but not something that defined him. The success of his movies, the adoration of his fans, had never been about ego. It was about sharing stories, creating connections, and doing work that he felt passionate about. And this was no different. As the months passed, the media attention surrounding the interview eventually faded, as all things in the public eye eventually do. The host moved on to new guests, new interviews, and new controversies, but something had changed. There was a lingering recognition that the way Keanu had conducted himself had set a new standard. He had shown that it was possible to stand firm in your beliefs without attacking others. He had demonstrated that you could be kind, quiet, and composed and still have an impact. And for Keanu, that was the ultimate victory. The attention, the praise, the accolades, it didn't matter to him. What mattered was that he had stayed true to who he was, and in doing so had shown the world a better way. A way of dealing with conflict that didn't involve anger or bitterness, but instead was rooted in kindness and respect. A way of being that didn't require constant validation or applause, but simply the willingness to do what was right, even when no one was watching. Keanu's approach to life, to fame, and to personal challenges had always been unconventional. He wasn't one for interviews that focused on drama or sensationalism. He didn't care for the celebrity culture that often sought to tear people down for sport. Instead, he had always preferred to focus on the work, the art, and the people who mattered most to him. And it was this approach that had served him so well throughout his career, not just as an actor, but as a person. In the aftermath of the interview, Keanu's legacy as a beloved actor was only further cemented. His films, of course, would always be remembered, but it was his character, his quiet strength, his refusal to engage in negativity, that would stay with people for much longer. In a world where public figures often found themselves caught up in drama and scandal, Keanu had remained steadfast in his belief that there was more to life than that. He had proven that true strength came not from battling others, but from maintaining your integrity in the face of adversity. As the years went by, the world continued to evolve. The media landscape shifted, and the way we viewed celebrities, interviews, and public personas transformed. But Keanu's place in it remained unchanged. He was not just an actor who had made his mark on the big screen. He was a symbol of quiet resilience, of living with purpose, and of the power of staying true to oneself. For Keanu, it was all just part of the journey. The spotlight came and went, but what truly mattered was how he lived his life. And as he continued to do the work he loved, surrounded by the people he cared about, it was clear that he had found something far more important than fame: peace. And that peace, it seemed, was all he ever really needed.